Okay, welcome everybody to the SRA webinar series. I think we're just going to turn this over to Roger so he can begin his presentation. Let me make you presenter, and then we'll be able to see your screen, and we'll be off to the races. Perfect, we see it.
Okay, thanks. So my name is Roger Flage. I'm a professor of risk analysis in the Department of Safety, Economics and Planning at the University of Stavanger in Norway. And in this webinar, I tell a story, my story of becoming, being and developing as a young risk scientist. So what I'll be talking about is, in a sense, my route into risk science. How did I end up here in an academic position in risk science? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about and reflect on two of my current job tasks. I'm currently the study program manager or coordinator for a master's program in risk analysis, and I'll be talking about managing and developing that program. And the other main topic is about creating a personal research agenda on risk science. But first, since this talk is to a large extent about risk science, I'll start with trying to clarify that term a little bit. So the definition that I'll be using is the one shown here, saying that risk science is the most updated and justified knowledge on risk fundamentals, risk assessment, risk perception and communication, risk management and governance, and also noting that risk science is also about the process, the practice that gives us this knowledge. And it's often useful in terms of understanding and communication to distinguish between generic and applied risk science. So generic or fundamental risk science is about knowledge generation related to general concepts, principles, theories, approaches, methods, models for understanding, assessing, characterizing, communicating, managing, and governing risk. For example, knowledge about how to best describe uncertainty in risk assessments. And applied risk science, on the other hand, is about knowledge generation related to specific activities or systems or problems. So, for example, knowledge about the risk related to climate change. So I won't say much more about these now, just introduce the concepts or the terms, but I will be referring to them throughout the presentation, so just keep them in mind. So SRA aims at advancing the science and practice of risk analysis. This is specified in the Society Strategic Plan. And we see that risk science is mentioned on several occasions in the strategy. It's also mentioned at the top here in the core ideology, in the vision, and also in the strategic goals of the society. So we see one of the strategic goals is to foster risk analysis as a science. And two of the means of doing so are to promote academic positions in risk analysis and educational programs at universities and colleges, and to promote research and development on fundamental issues of risk analysis. And in my talk today, I'm going to address exactly these topics. So having an academic position involves three main tasks, basically. At least that's how it is when you work at the University in Norway. You have to do teaching, you have to do research, and you have to disseminate your research and also scientific knowledge from your field in general. So I'll cover two of these, the first one and the last one, and of course doing this webinar can be seen as an example of the second one, the dissemination part. But first, I'm going to describe what has been my route, my way into risk science. So the standard European model for higher education is a 3-year bachelor's degree, followed by a 2-year master's degree, and finally a 3-year PhD degree. And this is what I've done in terms of education. So my bachelor's degree was in health, safety, and environmental engineering, and this is where I first came across risk and risk analysis is in an educational context through a course on risk and reliability analysis. I then went on to do a master's degree in offshore technology or offshore engineering, if you will, with a specialization in safety. although besides a minor course in offshore field development and a course in applied risk analysis that was really targeted or directed towards the oil and gas context, this was still a rather general program covering risk and safety as general concepts, not only in the context of offshore technology. And finally, I did a PhD in risk management and societal safety. And the main topic of my PhD thesis was uncertainty in risk assessment and risk management, and this was to a large extent about the generic risk science part. I then spent 3 years as a consultant, being hired out to an oil and gas company for a period of time, and besides that, performing various risk assessments and giving advice on risk management to a variety of customers in different sectors. And after these 3 years in consulting, I returned to academia. In Norway, we only have 2 post-PhD faculty position levels. Both are tenured, so one corresponding to assistant associate professor and then full professor. So not the 3 levels that you might be used to in the US, although we are starting to see some tenure track positions also in Norway. But the important point here is that since 2013, I've had an academic position in risk analysis or risk science. So my first encounter with risk analysis, as I said, was in a course called risk and reliability analysis in my bachelor's degree. I didn't reflect so much on it at that time, but in hindsight, it was really a course in risk assessment and maybe a little bit of risk management, but not covering risk perception, risk communication, or other main topics of the broad understanding of risk analysis. But already at this point, it was presented as a topic and a course in its own right. It wasn't linked to any particular application. It wasn't environmental risk assessment or financial risk assessment. It was risk assessment as a set of general concepts and methods and models. And this course in risk analysis, risk and reliability analysis, was my favorite course during my bachelor's degree. It's true, along with a couple of courses in microbiology, actually. So the lecturer in microbiology encouraged me to continue on to a master's degree in microbiology, but I was resistant and went for a risk analysis instead, and I have no regrets about that today. But was my initial plan or objective to become a risk scientist? No, that was actually not the case. Before and while I was studying for my bachelor's degree, my objective was simply to go on to take a master's degree in societal safety, because that seemed very interesting and exciting, and that was really what I wanted to do, and I didn't think much further than that. I ended up on a more technically oriented master's degree, but still in the risk and safety field. About halfway through my master's degree, I was strongly encouraged to pursue a PhD, and I became very motivated to do that, so that became my objective. And I did, and I enjoyed it, and so much so that roughly halfway through my PhD studies, my objective really became to come into a faculty position in risk analysis or in risk science. But that same someone who encouraged me to pursue a PhD also thought it would be a very good experience for me to get some experience with applied risk analysis and see life outside the university. And although I wasn't so happy about it at the time, in hindsight, this was a very good piece of advice, I think. And then once back at the university, I was all in on risk analysis and risk science. So I reflected a little bit on it while making this presentation, and doing so, I would say that there were both initial attractions and which came sort of when I started taking courses in risk analysis, and later attractions that developed after I started doing risk science research. So one initial attraction was that while the first encounter with risk analysis courses was on the generic side, there was still that applied flavor, at least more so than in the mathematics courses that I took, which I also really enjoyed. And there were, of course, important applications, I thought, since we're dealing with avoiding loss of life, loss of damage, loss of health, any type of losses. I also found, in some sense, risk analysis to have a broader purpose and scope than other courses that I really liked, like statistics. The statistical setting with data analysis, I found it to be a little bit narrow. So in risk analysis, especially risk assessment, the events, the quantities, they're not specified or given in a way. There's the possibility of surprises. That is something we have to consider in risk assessment. And data is only one input to the background knowledge that needs to be somehow transformed into scenario, consequence specifications and uncertainty assessments related to those. So after starting my PhD, I saw that risk science is still a relatively young field, and being led into research on foundational issues was useful, I think, because there were and still are many developments to be made there. And I found, still find, the conceptual basis to be attractive or elegant in some sense. Of course, there isn't complete agreement out there on the conceptual basis of risk science, for example, on how to even define risk. But there are some, I would say, there are some good candidates out there, and I find those to be, many of those to be solid and attractive. But it would be like a grave omission to not to highlight the importance of key mentors when talking about the motivation for becoming a risk scientist. So Terje was my PhD supervisor and has been, of course, a foremost mentor for me, both in early and later days. And I'm extremely grateful for that. I was also fortunate enough to be able to carry out 2 research days during my PhD studies. First, I was at Rutgers University working with Dave Coit and Jim Luxhøy. And then I was at Politecnico di Milano working with Enrico Zio and Piero Baraldi. And then when I came back into academia in 2013, I started working more closely with Seth Geikema, and that collaboration has continued to this day. With several joint PhD student supervisions and with a research day of mine at the University of Michigan back in 2016. And I would say working with and learning from these people, I think it's fair to say has been the greatest motivation of all, not only for wanting to become a risk analyst, but also for wanting to develop and at least strive towards becoming as good risk scientists as these are, as they are. And I would be lying if I said I wasn't both humbled and motivated by meeting several of the pioneers of risk science throughout the years at conferences. So for me, typically the SRA annual meeting and the European Safety and Reliability Conference, SRA, and meeting them there and on other occasions. I won't mention names as there are too many people to list here and now, and I don't want to highlight only some, although I guess I already have mentioned some with these photos, but at least that has been a very good, strong motivation for me as well. Okay, so now we come back into the 2 main topics of my talk, and we start with talking about managing and developing a master's program in risk analysis. So I'll start with some history about the risk and safety studies at the University of Stavanger. These studies grew out of the Norwegian, sort of the needs of the Norwegian petroleum industry in the 1980s for people with competence in risk and safety. And in the 80s and 90s, the master programs in risk and safety were specializations within petroleum and offshore engineering master programs. They weren't master programs on their own. In the 1990s, some natural disasters in Norway led to the establishment of a master's program in societal safety, aimed more towards, let's say, safety work in the public sector. And this master program is still running today and serves like it's running in Norwegian, and it's serving that Norwegian market for need for competence on safety. And it has both a non-engineering and an engineering specialization. Then sometime in the 2000s, I'm not entirely sure which year, but roughly then, the master program in risk management became a master's program in its own right, not a specialization within some other program as it had been before. It was called a master's degree in risk management. It was still an engineering degree, and it started out as a Norwegian program, but eventually turned into an international program with an international admissions quota and all courses taught in English. Then a few years ago, we started a new master's program in risk analysis and governance, and that was directed more towards the international non-engineering, let's say, market. And the result, as you can see, at one point was 3 separate master programs in risk and safety. But then they were the top 2 here were merged into one program with 2 specializations. And as of 2020, we're offering a master's degree in risk analysis with both a non-engineering and an engineering specialization. So the master's program in risk analysis at the University of Stavanger is an international master's program, meaning that it has an international admissions quota and that all courses are taught in English. So we have students from all over the world. For example, this year we admitted 3 students from the US, as well as students from Turkey, China, Mexico, Russia, and more. The study program has 2 specializations, one called Engineering Risk Analysis and Management for students coming in with any type of engineering bachelor's degree, and one called Risk Analysis and Governance, which is for students with other types of bachelor's degrees. So for example, a bachelor's degree in social science. Then there's a core set of courses indicated in blue here that cover the core topics of risk analysis. So fundamentals, risk assessment, risk communication, risk perception, risk management, risk governance, and policy on risk. And of course, everyone has to do the master's thesis in the last semester. Just a quick comment here that ECTS, as you can see, it stands for European Credit Transfer System, and 1 semester, so half a year, is 30 ECTS. Then there are some specialization courses indicated I tried to indicate them in yellow here for the non-engineering students and orange for the engineers. The engineering students, as you can see, take probability and statistics and reliability analysis. And the other students take courses in philosophy of science and research methods, and a course in selected topics in risk management. And then in the 3rd semester, the students either go abroad on an exchange to a university abroad, or as most students choose to do a set of elective courses, either the recommended ones or other electives that are indicated here. So as you can see, overall, this master's program is to very limited extent directed towards a particular application area. The objective is to educate risk analysts, not infrastructure risk analysts or environmental risk analysts or any other type of specialized risk analysts. That being said, the student's background, their bachelor's degree essentially gives them some sort of, let's say, system competence. For example, petroleum engineering, social work, healthcare, and so on. That they understand the context, the system very well, and then combining that with, let's say, method competence in risk analysis, they do get an advantage in doing risk analysis related to that application that they're coming in from. So for example, a petroleum engineer with a master's degree in risk analysis will of course have a very strong profile for applying risk analysis methods and models, approaches, and so on to, say, a petroleum production plant. When it comes to what the students aim to get out of their studies, there is like a spectrum between 2 extremes. I try to sort of paint that picture here. In one end, and somewhat caricatured, of course, is the student who just wants to get a job and see the means of doing so, but is to get a toolbox of methods and be shown a lot of practical examples of typical examples of these tools. And on the other hand is the student who aims to become a risk scientist, wants to pursue a PhD, want to learn how to think and approach risk problems from, so to say, first principles, and then be able to contribute to solve not only typical existing problems, but also new risk problems. And of course, for the broad student mass, there is a balance that needs to be struck here between the level of generic versus applied knowledge that is taught in the course. And our experience is that while there is always someone who wants to see more applications than examples, there are also those who strongly appreciate the generic side, and increasingly so throughout their studies, throughout the two years of master studies. And on this issue, I would actually be very happy to hear, if not questions, then at least other people's teaching experiences when we come to the question part of the semester. So if you have some experiences there, maybe a question, that I'll be happy to comment or an answer on that, because this is something that finding that balance is always tricky, and it's good to get some input, and even advice there. Okay, so what are some important experiences and strategic challenges associated with running such a program? I'll mention a few and distinguish between recruitment and teaching. So in terms of recruitment, there are both, our experience is that there are both opportunities and downsides of linking the program to a particular application area. As we saw earlier in my presentation, for many years, our program was linked to offshore oil and gas and benefited really strongly from that, since that was an attraction for many students. They wanted to work in that industry. Over the years, as I showed you, the program has been taken in a more generic direction, and this has been motivated primarily by actual desire to make it a program teaching generic risk analysis. But now with the green transition, it turns out to have been actually a good outcome decision, since recruitment to petroleum-oriented studies are plummeting, at least at our university and in Norway in general. In addition, we are facing the general and apparently increasing problem in the Western world of attracting engineering students. We get many non-engineering students, but we would like to see more engineering students, since we're not able to actually not able to fill our quotas on that. In terms of teaching, there is that balance between level of generic and applied knowledge to be taught, and it's almost impossible to please everyone here, I would say. And related to that is determining which application areas to highlight to the student. It's also a balance that needs to be struck between what is current, what the students find interesting here and now, and what are the interests and research interests of the faculty members teaching that program. Okay, so that was a little bit about managing and developing the master's program. So now we come into the second of the two main topics. It's about creating a personal research agenda on risk science. So how would I characterize my core research areas? So in terms of the main topic areas of risk analysis, I would say my work has been mostly related to risk assessment and also risk management, and actually very little related to risk communication and risk perception. A particular topic that I've written quite extensively on is risk assessment assumptions, how to deal with such assumptions in the risk assessment, and then how to follow them up into the risk management related to the activity in question. In terms of foundations, uncertainty has been a major topic ever since my PhD work, mostly about uncertainty characterization or uncertainty representation. And I've also published a little bit on selected risk-related concepts, in particular emerging risk and the black swan metaphor. And finally, in terms of application areas, most of the research projects that I've been involved in so far have been related to offshore oil and gas, and then mostly personnel safety or personnel risk issues. But through PhD students' work, I've also gone into, for example, environmental risk assessment, infrastructure risk and vulnerability assessment, and even security risk assessment. A fairly common response when I tell people that I work in so my area of research is risk analysis, I would actually say the most common response from both lay people and research colleagues from other fields is risk analysis. Oh, that's interesting, but risk analysis of what exactly? So they're very much seeing risk analysis as something linked to specific applications. If I just want to have a short conversation, I say related to oil and gas, and that's sort of the end of the conversation often. But sort of if I'm in a more talkative mood, I say after some explaining that, and most people appreciate sort of the relevance and appropriateness of studying generic risk analysis, especially if I explain the analog to statistics. So statistics is considered a science in its own right, but it's also being applied to a lot of areas, for example, medical statistics. And also here it would be very interesting to hear other attendees' experiences when sort of what do people say when you say that you're a risk analyst or a risk scientist. But how does this influence interdisciplinary collaboration? I'm commonly approached with something like, we're applying for a project on improved oil recovery methods, on wind farms, on batteries, or whatever topic or application area. That should be of great interest for you to join, since you study risk analysis. And sure, there are many interesting topics and application areas, but if I decide to join a project or an application for a project, it's most of the time because I see the potential for finding inspiration for some generalizable risk analysis knowledge. For example, a general or a generalizable method to do risk assessment. But still, usually we talk and they understand my motivations, and we always find a basis for working together. Okay, so how to think when identifying and pursuing research topics with the aim of contributing to risk science. I'll get there, but I would like to start with an example of how a generic method for evaluating the bias of risk assessment assumptions came out of a project on petroleum geology and environmental risk management. I'm participating in a research center for Arctic petroleum exploration, ARCEX, which is a collaboration between several academic and industry partners. And my work in this center is related to environmental risk assessment and management. And a main, let's say, a main aim of the work package that I'm involved in is to reduce accident risk. Petroleum activities have, as you may know, been carried out for decades in Norway, but then mostly in the southern and middle parts of the Norwegian continental shelf. In the in the North Sea and in the Norwegian Sea. It's only relatively recently that sort of exploration and production activities have moved into the northern part, towards the Arctic. And compared to the more well-known petroleum provinces further south, there are at least two characteristics of the Arctic when it comes to environmental risk. One is the presence of new risk sources, so polar lows, icing, icebergs, sea ice, a lot of things to do with ice, of course, and potential different vulnerabilities of the environmental components that are there, such as fish and seabirds. So one implication of these characteristics is reduced relevance of past knowledge, past operational experience, and past analytical practice. So the uncertainties to be characterized and treated in the risk assessments increase. But environmental risk assessments are, of course, routinely carried out in the Norwegian petroleum industry using a well-established guideline as the methodological basis. And in terms of uncertainty treatment, the guideline prescribes use of best knowledge, use of conservative values, regular updating of data as uncertainty reduction strategies, and then use of probability distributions for uncertainty representation. So having worked on the topic of risk assessment assumptions in the past, I was reading these guidelines, and that sort of led me in the direction of thinking about conservative and then more generally biased assumptions. So one observation that I made looking at the method for environmental risk assessment and looking at different specific environmental risk assessment that had been carried out was that the assumptions were not treated in a very documented or systematic way. And this was very different from how I was used to seeing assumptions being dealt with in quantitative or probabilistic risk assessment that deal with personnel safety. In these QRAs, PRAs, assumptions are typically well documented, and at least in some of the cases, for some of the assumptions, subject to sensitivity analysis. So the outcome of working on this project was a paper that essentially does two things. It demonstrates how to apply an uncertainty-based risk conceptualization in the context of environmental risk assessment. So it takes a real-world problem context, let's call it that, and applies generic risk analysis knowledge to that context. And it develops a method, and the paper develops a method for assessing the bias of assumptions made in environmental risk assessment, but presents it in such a way that, in a general way, so that it's clear how this assessment scheme also can be applied in other settings. So it's an example of how an applied project led to development of a general method. So if we now come to talk more generally about how to think when identifying and pursuing these research topics when you want to contribute to risk science. So I'll point at two approaches. So one is, as I just presented, to start from a real world risk problem, but to focus not only on solving that problem by applying generic or general risk analysis knowledge to that problem, but also to think of how solving that problem, real world problem, might contribute to generic risk analysis, for example, by making a method that can be generalized and used basically anywhere to other types of applications or problems as well. Another approach is to work more, let's say, within the generic risk analysis area. This would be more purely conceptual research, reviewing, discussing, and suggesting improvements of risk analysis concepts, principles, approaches, frameworks, methods, and models. This type of research is discussed in a fairly recent risk analysis paper by Terje, and an example of this type of research is reported in a paper I show here that the two of us wrote together on emerging risk, discussing this concept and how it's related to the concept of black swan events. So coming towards the end of my presentation now, I'd like to reflect just a little bit on the prospects of developing a career as a young risk scientist. There seems to be no end to crises and accidents taking place in the world. So from the perspective of applying risk science to make a better world, so to speak, the prospects are rather good, one could say. And there are many areas of applied risk analysis aimed at specific types of systems, specific types of hazards or threats, and aimed at specific consequence dimensions or consequence types, and which help to solve these, let's say, real-world risk problems. These areas build on and also inspire developments in generic risk analysis, covering, as I already mentioned several times, general or application-independent concepts, principles, approaches, methods, and models. Many people spend their careers in one of these applied areas, and many academic positions are also in this applied area. My message here is that there are very good scientific prospects of looking also more inwards towards the generic risk analysis part. I'm not saying that everyone should become a risk scientist focusing purely on generic risk analysis, but I think that a greater awareness and attention to the generic part could lead to both advances in generic risk analysis, but also to more cross-fertilization across application areas for risk analysis. So my own research agenda is, I would say, the result of two types of processes: idea-driven processes and project or opportunity-driven processes. So the idea-driven process is mostly related to the generic risk analysis part. I have a text file where I constantly add ideas, either just a title, sometimes a sentence, a partial abstract, as ideas come to me when I read the literature, when I discuss with colleagues, go to conferences, and so on. And at some point, one or more of the ideas in that list turns into a project, either by just choosing to write a paper or by applying for project funds for a more extensive project leading to several publications. University positions in Norway are fully funded, and I get approximately 50% of my working time paid to do research or of course to apply for more research project funds. And that of course helps to be able to follow up the idea-driven processes. The project or opportunity-driven processes is related to research projects that I'm invited into. This happens from time to time, and I tend to try and say yes to those projects where I see that there is a potential for creating some generalizable risk analysis knowledge, like the assumption bias scheme that I talked about earlier. And that's essentially the end of my presentation. So thanks very much for your attention. And if there are any comments or questions, I'll be happy to try and answer those.
Yeah, so we don't have any typed in yet, but it usually takes a little bit for folks to type their questions in. So
Yeah.
let's give them a minute. Oh, we're starting to see some. We'll ask those. Maybe you could remind folks what you wanted, the two items that you wanted feedback on about. Yeah, and then we can start asking questions.
So one of them was when sort of running or designing or running a study program in risk analysis, how to get that balance between sort of the generic risk analysis knowledge and sort of the applied examples part. And what was I don't remember what the other one was.
That's okay. It's okay. Let's take this first question. This one's from Matthew Stogsdill. It says, what do you see as the current biggest issue or weakness within the risk research field?
That's a big question, of course. Looking at sort of all the main topics within risk analysis, you can say that there are certainly sort of issues within risk assessment, within risk management, within risk perception, and I can't speak for all of them. As I said, I haven't done that much research in some parts of risk analysis. But if we look at risk analysis field as a whole, I would say that one major issue is understanding the role of and the concept of knowledge in relation to risk and in relation to risk descriptions, risk assessment, risk perception, and so on. I think that is something that I really want to pursue myself. The other sort of main challenge or problem is sort of getting people to understand what risk analysis is really about and how it can contribute to make an impact on the world stage, so to speak, and impact on politics and policies and so on. And I think that the COVID pandemic has shown that there is great potential for using risk analysis knowledge to handle that type of situation.
Yeah, informed decision making for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, so no additional comments or questions yet. We'll give everybody another minute or two here. But while we're waiting and hoping that they will type something in, I will say thank you again for a great presentation. That was very enjoyable. And so let's just see, we'll give them a minute or two. And then you'll be, let's see, it's about dinner time for you over there, yeah?
Oh yeah, I've already had my dinner before this presentation, okay. So I wasn't hungry and sort of low on energy when I started, so I already ate.
Okay, well, we don't have any additional questions or comments. I'll invite people. Oh wait, we do. We just got one, but I will also invite people to send in comments and questions later if they occur to you, and we'll get them over to Roger for you. So this one is from Aizi Yildiz. It says, what was your biggest challenge during your early career, and what would be your recommendation to overcome it for young researchers?
That's a good, very good question, I think. Well, it was a challenge to me actually, first to sort of get that academic position. I was sort of thrown out of academia because that would be a good experience, and it really was. But sort of getting into it, but I was quite lucky it was more or less luck coming back into my position. So I don't think necessarily that's a good answer. I think one thing that maybe not during to sort of find what should be my area of sort of expertise. That has been something that I've sort of been struggling a little bit with, and several mentors have given me that advice to sort of go deep on something. And I guess that for me that was sort of the uncertainty, looking at uncertainty in relation to risk concept and risk description, and that sort of became my main topic area. But that's also sort of came to me in in my PhD project. So I'm just thinking thinking out loud here. Yeah, no. So one problem has been sort of that overload of projects, being invited into too many projects that sort of takes time away from sort of the core issues that you want to do research on. Yeah, so I think that would be that has been a challenge all of the time, because I like to say yes, and maybe I say at least in my early career said yes too much, and I was getting into sort of projects that made me sort of committed for many years. Now I've become better at saying no, and now my strategy is, as I said in the presentation there, to sort of look at the project. Do I see a potential here for doing something related or generalizable, something that can bring me more towards that generic part? And if I do, then, and I have sort of see that I have time, then and like the topic of the project, then sure. But otherwise, it can actually be a good idea sometimes to say no, and because it doesn't sort of fit into that overall research strategy or research agenda that you have. I think that would be my greatest challenge, to say no to projects. And as I said, my strategy there has been to sort of look very carefully at what I'm being sort of offered or presented with, and sort of does it fit within my research agenda. Yeah.
Well, now we have a whole bunch of questions.
Okay, I shouldn't. Too long answer.
No, it was good. So this one is from Hiba Barud, and it says, given the interdisciplinary nature of risk analysis research, what is your advice for students and young scholars trying to identify a specific career path within different fields like engineering, social science, arts, etc.?
Well, I think that reading up on and sort of becoming aware of and reading up on really that sort of core generic risk analysis literature, that can be very useful, because you can get a lot of inspiration there for doing developments within that sort of application area that you're working in. So I think actually reading, sort of going back, read risk analysis journal articles back to the 80s and 90s. Look at sort of the pioneers of risk analysis, as I talked about. Look at Kaplan Garrick and Apostolakis and Vicky Beer and all of those, and read up on that and really sort of learn that generic core part, and then you will find a lot of ideas to sort of make developments within that applied area, I think. And hopefully you will also then be able to do something in your sort of application area that can feed back into the generic part.
Great. I'm taking this next one out of order because it's both complementary to you and mentions SRA. So here we go. This is from Ingrid Gillette Iverson. It says, in 2020, you won the SRA Chauncey Starr Distinguished Young Risk Analyst Award. Already making this major accomplishment, what is your next big ambition?
That's a very good. That's a very good question, and I've actually been struggling with that question since I got sort of promoted to full professor. What should be my sort of next big challenge, big objective? And I'm not sure I've sort of arrived at anything yet, but as I said, I would like to really go deep in that area, looking into sort of the knowledge concept in relation to risk and risk assessment and so on. So that's sort of topically, but I guess also getting funding for like a big project and be the project manager and not just like a work package leader. That would be so maybe a big Research Council of Norway project or an EU project. I think that is sort of should be there for me, sort of as an objective. Yeah.
Excellent. This next one is a bit of an observation and an answer to one of your questions. So this is from Matthew Stogsdill. It says, regarding the balance between applied and generic, one thing that helped me was trying to combine risk analyses from multiple areas into a meta-analysis. Trying to do that really showed the need for a strong understanding of the generic principles in order to operate, in order to incorporate methods and definitions from different perspectives and stakeholders.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good piece of advice, and I've seen that sort of in other master programs or master courses where they sort of do that type of sort of showing students different application areas and sort of the underlying sort of message being, look at what they're doing here, look at what they're doing here. But if you look at both of them, it's actually much of the same. There is that sort of core of the risk assessment process. It's basically the same, just different names, different titles in the boxes. But there is that sort of general sort of core there. And we're also creating now a new course in applied risk analysis, where I think the objective is to do something like that, to sort of show the students a little bit from that industry, a little bit from that industry, but also then make them reflect on, so what's common here. So I think that's a really good comment or observation and suggestion coming there. Yeah.
Great. Our next one is from Kemal Das. It says, could you please share your thoughts on the necessity of an advanced degree for anyone who is working on risk assessment? And for advanced degrees, would you recommend an MS or a master's or a PhD? And thank you for your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, as I showed in that presentation there, I think that combination of having a bachelor's degree that gives you that sort of system, you understand the context, the system that you're analyzing, whether it's sort of a healthcare system or it's a more engineering system. Having that sort of system background and then doing an advanced degree, typically a master's degree if you want to go into industry, that's a very good combination. Whether you do master's degree or a PhD, here in Norway, most do master's degrees. So we have like 60 study places in that risk analysis master program, and every year we get just a handful, 1 or 2 PhD students. So most do that master's degree, and I think that if your aim is sort of to not just to get a job, but if you're not aiming for academia, then a master's degree should be sufficient. But it's important that it's a good master's degree and that it has that sort of good balance between generic and applied. But I would certainly recommend doing a PhD if you are sort of interested more in the sort of becoming a real expert on something, whether that is something within the generic part or an expert in applied risk analysis within a specific area. Yeah, I'm not sure if that was an answer, but it was an attempt at an answer at least.
It was a good answer. The next question is from Samuel Velasquez, and it says, Dr. Flago, what will be the major advice you can provide to make the transition from industry to academia and teaching?
Yeah, that was a very interesting transition for myself. I think it's sort of going from, at least coming from consulting, it was sort of very focused on getting the job done quickly, and then maybe doing sort of 80% is good enough. But coming into academia, you really have to spend more time and do things in a slightly more solid way. So that is one piece of advice, to sort of think deeply and carefully about the things you're doing. And I guess another advice would be, don't only tackle the real world risk problems that I talked about, which you typically do in industry. You have to just get the job done and solve that problem, but also think about that link back to the generic part. So sort of, okay, I can help solve this risk problem sort of from a research point of view, but how can I draw something out of that that I can sort of give back to the generic part. So how can I generalize what I've done here, and so that others can apply it, or I can apply it to other application areas. I think to have that mindset to think like that is really important.
Great. Next one is from Sanya Kovacevic, and it says, which part of the research process do you find the most fascinating?
That's also a very good question from Sanya there. Most fascinating, I think, is the sort of the idea development phase, sort of when you develop sort of what is the core main idea of a paper that you write. And as I said, that is about, you have to read a lot, you have to talk with other scientists, you have to go to conferences and just think very hard at a topic or at a problem, and then sort of seeing how that idea just sometimes just comes to you. That is deeply fascinating for me. As I said during the presentation, I did a research day at Rutgers University, and I came there with a sort of prepared abstract, and this is what I want to do, and my advisors there didn't really understand where I was going, and I wasn't able to convey what I wanted to do, and they said, okay, just start reading some literature in an area that you want to look into, and I did, and several weeks, and I read, and I met with them and reported and tried to find ideas, and I one day coming back from lunch, I can point at the place in the parking lot, coming back to the building where I was sitting, and then just the idea struck me, and I almost ran back to the office and wrote down the idea and sent it, and then got a sort of thumbs up on that. So I think that the most fascinating part is that idea generation phase.
Great. Samuel Velasquez, who asked a question just earlier, said, thank you for the insight.
Thank you.
So that's good. The next one is from Mumtahina Riza, and it says, which type of quantitative skills and experience are required to enter the profession related to risk science?
Well, I would say probability and statistics is of course core sort of quantitative areas that you really need to master, and maybe also some more mathematics if you want to do more on the consequence analysis side of things. But I think it's important for someone to be able to go very deep and to have that deep quantitative knowledge, like engineers and statisticians and mathematicians. But there are also a lot of risk analysts who don't necessarily need to have that deep quantitative skill set, but they should still be taught and understand what is a probability, what does it express, and then when they see a probability, they should be able to ask the question: is this a frequentist probability? Is it an estimate of a frequentist probability, or is it a subjective probability? Because that has implications for how you interpret it and what sort of status you give to it, and how you use it in decision making. So yes, sort of you need some probability and statistics and maybe more mathematics, but equally important, I would say, is to teach everyone learning risk analysis, whether they want to specialize in risk perception, communication, or going deep into the quantitative side, just that understanding of what the numbers and what we're talking about here, that interpretation part, and that was sort of an eye opener for me. Learning about, for example, subjective probabilities. I learned about that in that course in risk and reliability analysis in my bachelor's degree. And I was very skeptical about that when I read about it in the book. This is your degree of belief. No, that's not how I've been taught probability before, but actually subjective probabilities is a very sort of well-known and much used concept in risk assessment. So it's not that problematic, but you have to understand what type of probability is, sort of what status does this have when you do decision making based on it.
So we have two more questions.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So we we have a thank you for that from that one from Mamtahina. It says, thank you very much for the answer and the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
So the penultimate question is from Werner Berger, and it says, what is the title of your next book?
Well, I haven't thought, honestly, I haven't thought about writing a new book yet. I did write a book with Tai Aven and Enrico Zio and Piero Baraldi based on our collaboration over several years. But I haven't, I don't have a working title for any books right now. Sorry.
That was your big opportunity to plug a new book. And so the last question is from Lois Agyapong. It says, what random advice would you give a PhD student focusing on environmental risk analysis?
That's also a good question. Well, as I told about in the presentation, I did go into that area in this ArcX project, and I have a PhD student now who's looking at environmental risk related to improved oil recovery, and so I have some experience in that area. But so my advice would be, okay, look at that generic, read up a little bit on the generic risk analysis or on other applied risk analysis application fields, and see how can that stimulate the idea generation in your field, because you can often get sort of ideas or cross-fertilization from other applications or from the generic path, and make sort of very good contributions in your application then. So I would say read a lot, and from the generic risk analysis literature, but also from other applied risk analysis areas, and see how can I do this, apply this, or develop this, of course, within your field. So don't just read environmental risk assessment literature, also read up on others and try to learn something from that.
Thank you very much. That was a great ending question too, and thank you to the organizers who put together the SRA webinar series every month, and thank you especially, Roger, for your presentation today. This was fantastic. Thanks. And the question and answer period not only was really good and informative, but is ending and giving everybody 1 minute of their day back. So nicely done. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next month. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.